Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Border Chronicle podcast, where we bring you news and analysis from the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. My name is Caroline Tracey, and I cover the arts and the environment for the Border Chronicle. And today I'm bringing you an interview with Gabriela Rangel, who is the new director of Tucson, Arizona's Museum of Contemporary Art. With Gabriela, I spoke about her trajectory from growing up in Venezuela to working at museums across the Americas, from Buenos Aires to New York. We spoke about the concept of Latin American art and how the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and Tucson fit into that idea. Here is our conversation. Well, I wanted to ask you to start, maybe if you could talk about your trajectory from growing up in Venezuela and coming to the United States.
That's a tough one. Well, I came to the States when Hugo Chavez became the president, and I got a scholarship to go to Bard. And then things became much more complicated, and I stayed in the U.S. and I worked with Mari Carmen Ramirez in the new chapter that she initiated at the Museum of Fine Arts in the Latin American department. And then I got invited to submit a proposal for the American Society, and then after 3 years working with Mari Carmen, with whom I, learn a lot about the field of Latin American art, which exists outside of Latin America. Now it's in Latin America, but at the time it was something that it was constructed from abroad. And it was really interesting for me because I was in the process of, this tectonic movements in my own nation state. So then I moved to New York to the American Society, which was a Cold War institution. And I thought about how do we transform a Cold War institution when the Cold War is supposed to be finished, and to make it feasible for, global capitalism, and in a way that serves, like a scholarship that makes sense in New York, like a Kunsthalle, not a cultural diplomacy institution, but much more a Kunsthalle. So that was my challenge, and I spent 15 years there. Then I quit when I was offered to be the director of the Malva, which is a private museum in Buenos Aires, again, dedicated to collect Latin American art, but the definition of Latin America that it exists in Argentina, which is different from the rest of the continent or the subcontinent. And it was really interesting, but it broke the pandemic, so it was very complicated and difficult. So after 2 years, I made a big project dedicated to the relationship between Argentine art and psychoanalysis that was called Terapia. And I made a couple of other, contributions. I think my project on the web during the pandemic called History as Rumor, it was a reconstitution of oral histories and mythologies about performances that occurred in Latin America, not necessary from Latin American artists, most of them were, but that were key to the development of a field of performance art, and how technology changed, the invention of the internet changed, the reconfiguration of documents and archive in that process. So, and then I went back to New York, and I started to think about what would I do now. And I was preparing a book that I haven't finished, which is a book about Venezuelan art in the 60s. But then I started to work in independent projects about artists who were key to the 60s, narrative, 2 women artists, Tecla Tofano and Elsa Gramco. And I made 2 books in collaboration to galleries, commercial galleries, that take those risks sometimes. It depends on the gallery. And I was also working at the New York Public Library. They gave me, a booth to do research. And I was, consultant until I became executive director at Tucson, the MoCA Tucson, which I started in September 2025 last
Great.
year.
Yeah. I'm curious to ask you about a couple of things you just mentioned. One is, could you explain what it means to be a Cold War institution, the Americas?
Yeah, it's an institution created to tell the story of a narrative that was very political at the time, was the presence of the U.S. in some foreign policies. We know that history is written. I don't have to tell you the story, but this institution was created by David Rockefeller in order to have a space in which entrepreneurs and people from the cultural field could talk in different terms of the clash between some cadres of the intellectual world in Latin America and entrepreneurs who were very close to processes of dictatorship in the region. Because on Venezuelan, we didn't have that. We didn't have the same Cold War as the Cold War model that occurred in the Southern Cone in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil. We had a democracy that lasted 40 years, a little bit more. For me, I have like a different perspective of the Cold War. But that's an institution of the Cold War. I mean, cultural diplomacy at the service of certain political constructions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wasn't really familiar with that particular institution, but my undergraduate major was in Russian, and there's all this funding, from the U.S. government for students to study Russian, but everyone ends up studying art and literature, and of course the funding was supposed to train diplomats. So it's kind of this funny Cold War legacy that there's oddly a lot of humanities funding in certain places because of that political moment.
We'll miss that funding in the humanities.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Latin American art as a concept was sort of invented outside of Latin America. Was it
in France in the 19th century, and then it evolved at the beginning of the 20th century. Was much more related to the avant-gardes in some avant-garde movements in Latin America, especially literary avant-gardes, and then it had different moments. Well, in the 20s was different from the 50s, and then it was different from the 60s, and then from the 80s. And when I worked with Mari Carmen, she was building a network of very important people who were responding to the processes of modernity and modernization in a critical manner, and much more related to minorities, much more related to minorities that were not represented in those processes. Now it's like it's a common ground, but at the time it was not very popular. So I thought it was interesting, to work with Mari Carmen, because she put together this network of people who were, building a critical discourse in their countries. Mm-hmm. And even Chicano people, or people who were born in the U.S. from, a Latin American or Caribbean background. And that was really interesting for me.
Yeah. Did you, in your sort of education and formation, set out to specialize in Latin American art, or was it something that sort of happened along the way through working with her?
Well, I lived in Cuba. I started filming in Cuba, so this was something that it was in my interest always. And this regional discourse, which doesn't exist anymore, it's much more related to markets and some other kind of formations, was very political at the time. And I was very interested in that. And how do we build something in common? And mm-hmm. how do we create an alternative canon? Or do we belong to the West or not? that was another question, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
I remember that I went to a talk by Catherine David, who was the director of Documenta, the Documenta 10, which was a very important Documenta, a very radical one. And she came and gave a lecture, and she talked about Latin America as belonging to the West. And I was like, oh my God, I never thought that we were not Western people, but we were not at the end of the day, and we're still not. So it's really interesting to see how are you defined by, you know, foreign policies and some other canons that are not yours.
Yeah, I remember like kind of a kerfuffle like 10 or 15 years ago at Yale in the undergraduate art history major. They had included on the sort of list of acceptable non-Western courses that would fulfill the non-Western requirement, they included African American art, even though obviously by definition that's produced in the United States. And so it's kind of like, you know, even though it's in the New World or in the Occident, that's the subaltern is not Western or something like that.
Yeah, you let me pick a concept that you just threw, you know, which is the Gramscian, the subaltern.
Mm-hmm.
That was my interest at the time, to understand how do we build this, you know, historical counter-narrative after many things that happened in the 20th century, which was, as we know, a short century.
Right. Yeah, and it's sort of one of those questions that doesn't get resolved easily. It takes years to think about. Yeah. How have you found sort of working in Latin American art different in the different cities that you've worked in?
I think it's contextual. For example, what in Argentina they call Latin American art is Argentine art in relation to the subcontinent. But for example, the Caribbean never existed there. Even though they have very important people from the Caribbean, like writers who went during the times of the Borgesian canon, but it was always marginal, you know. Their national construction is different from the Venezuelan one, which was very much informed by the fact that we have a founding father who was, you know, a revolutionary, and in the 20th century we have the oil, you know, industry, which made my country very much closer to the U.S. than any other, probably, perhaps Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
Or, yeah, I think the comparison is with Puerto Rico, and here in the Southwest is totally different. It's Mexico. It's the Sonoran Desert.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask you, you know, how do you see Latin American art in Tucson? What is the sort of what is the presence of it in Tucson?
I don't think there is a presence of Latin American art. I think there is a strong. Well, Tucson is very particular because Tucson it's very much informed by the university.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Mexico is here, Latin America, but Mexico is North America too. So I think Mexico has a very particular relationship with the Southwest. Not only Tucson, but the Southwest. Particularly in Tucson because of the university and also the border. It's here. It's a borderland city.
Yeah. And does the borderlands or the border as a concept, you know, I think from our perspective, because many of us, me and the listeners, live in the borderlands, we think it's super important. But I'm curious, you know, does the U.S.-Mexico border figure into contemporary art in an important way?
Yeah, I think so, because I think there are urgent matters that are pretty much in the repertoire of contemporary art that were, you know, that are very crucial for that borderland. You know, water, ecosystems, migration. Those are issues that contemporary art has adopted in their concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a tendency to reduce them sometimes, But I think they're there because what we call contemporary art is very much about that, about what's going on in the present.
Yeah, I mean, as with any, I guess, complex topics, there are sort of more and less complex ways to deal with it in art. You can sort of have like a very reduced treatment of water and a very complex and interesting one with any topic. So yeah.
Yeah, but probably water is more important even than nuclear energy right now. It's a real thorny issue.
Yeah. And one that I have the impression that many artists are thinking a lot about water. I feel like I keep coming across, even just in the borderlands, artists that are thinking about it.
Yeah, in a way that probably people from the cities are not aware of. They live in a different kind of world. They live in bubbles. The urban areas in this country, they live in a different social temporality.
Yeah.
Therefore, they don't have this, issue of the water.
They're living in a social temporality that's what is the difference between a sort of regional and an urban social temporality?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I guess here maybe I'm just speculating as to, you can correct me. The social temporality is more sort of oriented about the future and like running out of water, or
Yeah, it's much more abstract. It's much more theoretical. Here is tangible. It's something that really informs your way of living and your survival, and even the existence. It's an existential issue.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
not
it's
an abstract manner.
Yeah, it's something that's interested me because I think in the Southwest, people within the Southwest think a lot about water, but also people outside the Southwest sort of associate it with the Southwest as a major issue. But I always think, like in a city like New York City, of course, they also have to import water, like Tucson, we have to import water, but New York City does not enough rain falls to serve all the people that live there. So water infrastructure is also something there. It's just not as present.
But people don't think about where the water comes from.
Yeah.
They're thinking about other, matters. They're thinking about, as you said, what is the future?
Mm-hmm.
What is the future of, humanities, for example? What are we talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence? There are many other issues that, are concerns of people who live in the city.
Yeah.
They're more macro, not micro.
Yeah, the sort of big questions that people think about in different regions are different. That's interesting.
It's contextual, but we tend to think that we live in a country called the United States of America. Godard always said that it's a country without a name. It has a name, United States of America, and that means that it's not a country. It's a conglomerate of different regions that are not necessarily the same. They have important differences. The Southwest is not similar to the East Coast or to the West Coast or to the center of the country or to the north. To the south.
Yeah, absolutely.
I lived in Houston. It's different from Texas.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
It's a different country.
What was sort of enticing or attractive to you about coming to Tucson to work, or coming to the Southwest, the borderlands?
Well, I was very interested in the relation with Mexico. Mexico is probably the country that I'm more closer to at this point. I have my very good friends are there, and I have a very profound connection to and with Mexican artists, and it's an ongoing. It's the country that I decided it's my beloved country in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very close to Mexico City.
Yeah.
To Mexico and Mexico City.
Yeah. Are there particular artists that Mexican artists that you've worked with the most or thought about the most?
Well, I have worked with many of them, but I have an ongoing relationship with a few of them who are, doing different things. They're very different among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to mention them,
Yeah.
But well, I did a very nice project. I think it was a project precisely about artificial intelligence and memory and human rights and history with Tania Candiani in Bogota. It took place at the Fragmentos, Arte y Memoria. I was invited by Doris Salcedo to do something there. It's a museum that she initiated. And I invited Tania because Tania was working with issues of technology and memory. And she invented this device in which she read the floor and she read the image and the sounds of the space where we were doing the exhibition, and the floor was made of melted weapons from the years of violence, which never ceased to exist. There is violence there everywhere, but the floors were made by with these weapons, melted weapons, and they were modeled by victims of sexual violence in Colombia, women.
Wow.
So she created this device to produce images and sound of the floors, but she did the same with Tlatelolco. So she brought her history, Mexico City, the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the three layers of history, and she did the same. She created a device that read, interpret the image and the sound.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting project.
Yeah. And, I'm guessing that some of our podcast listeners will not necessarily be familiar with the work of a curator or museum director. Can you talk about when you plan a show like that, what sort of decisions are you making versus what kind of decisions are the artists making? How does your work sort of unfold in an exhibition?
Well, there are many ways to work, but if you work with a living artist who happens to be a very apt and well-informed artist, apt meaning an artist who is informed about not only his or her present, the history, who's a critical artist, then you have to sit down and work in equal terms. It's not that you're curating the show, but you are building a dialogue that necessarily had to have, something in the space and time too. That's when you work with a living artist who is, a person it's a dialogical space, much more than that you select it. No, if you invite someone who develops a project with you. When you work with a dead artist or with an archive, it's different. Mm-hmm. It's much more your interpretation, and also there is a doxa there. There are things already written, already interpreted, already said, already not said, and you have to do that's the role of interpretation. That's the role of a historian or a critic, and it's a different role. But there are many modalities. Some curators are like artists, and some curators are much more like critics or historians. It's very different.
Yeah. Does it ever happen that you are working with a living artist who's present in the decision making, but there is, they are well known enough that there is kind of the same doxa that you mentioned, like this existing field of interpretation that people have decided their work means, and you have to kind of work with it or against it?
That's a very difficult question because it depends, because I have worked with artists who are public intellectuals, and those artists created their own discourse publicly, not only in the work, but also how the work is perceived. And I think it's, and now you have to add the gallery, which is another layer. Galleries also are gatekeepers of the artist, and they they protect the artist from, misinterpretations, aggressions, self-deprecation, and many, agents that can challenge the work of the artist. Mm-hmm. So it's super complicated that issue of, making public something that was meant to be public. Because when you make an artwork, you're not doing an artwork for yourself. It exists when you have a viewer, when you have a public, an audience. That's what makes an artwork. If you make an artwork and you leave it in your living room or in your studio, I mean, it doesn't have like the Duchampian collective apparatus that you need to become an artwork.
Yeah, I was just sort of imagining, there must be some artists where the sort of critical or interpretation has been very rigid, but that would have the opportunity to sort of challenge that in the curation of a big show or something like that. So,
well, there are cases in our history, for example, neglected women who, remain 40, 50 years in silence, making their work. But then when they died or somebody came and saw the work, it became an artwork because it belonged to the system.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated question. I don't know. Nowadays we have some challenges to understand that process differently. I think with the invention of certain technologies of entertainment and technologies of interpretation, also everything changed.
Yeah.
It's changing, it's evolving, it's taking different paths.
Right, yeah. Sometimes people are coming to a museum to see work that they've already seen many times on Instagram or something like that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I don't know what a museum is nowadays because there are museums of museums. I think it's a different topic when you visit a museum in a city. It's different than when you visit a museum in a non-urban environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I read your profile that Mari Carmen Barrios wrote, and I liked the quotation that you told her, that you said that in Mexico you discovered you were a public servant, and I was curious what you mean by that.
Well, I curated a very controversial CTAC, which was a symposium of contemporary art and theory, and it was very controversial because it was about feminism and gender, and at the time it was not, a woman was not allowed to talk about that openly in a contemporary art forum, in a very complicated environment. So I took it as a public servant kind of thing. I have to do it because I have to work for an audience that needs to be informed about these topics that only some isolated artists have done. Or thinkers, not only artists, historians, critics, people at academia. But academia is academia. They're protected, You're an academic. You know what academia is. It's a sphere of, in a way it was protected. Now it's not protected because it's under attack, the attack of the instances of power. But when I made a CTAC, only in academia you can talk about that in Mexico. So I moved that from the academia to the center.
Is the concern that if you look at an artist through a feminist lens, they would be sort of relegated to being just feminist artists, or that they would be considered sort of lesser in their heft or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
I see. Gotcha.
Not only that, but reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Reduced to the mere realm of activism or resentfulness or marginalization, but they will never read the work in their contributions to discussions about, performativity or, I don't know.
Right. They would just be representing sort of a special interest or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's my role, public servant.
And how does, I guess I know you've worked in both museums and in galleries, at least in Mexico City. How does that sort of role of being a public servant, of informing the public, figure differently in museums versus galleries?
Galleries, I don't have this prejudice or this, kind of misunderstanding of what is the role of a gallery. Because the galleries, commercial galleries today, if you pay attention to what happened in the last 20 years in New York, for example, and Mexico City is very much like New York in Spanish. Mm-hmm. I don't see a difference between Mexico City and... I think Mexico City is more interesting than New York nowadays. But in Mexico City, you have galleries that really take the role of a museum sometimes. I'm not saying that that's permanent. It could happen as an occurrence, Somebody convinces the owner of the gallery or the director of the gallery and organizes an exhibition that it's a pending matter of a museum, something that never occurred. That happened to me in New York when I saw, the exhibition that Hilton Als made of Alice Neal or James Baldwin or Toni Morrison. Those exhibitions were amazing. They were models of how do you understand the relationship between a public figure and the discourse in art that could change the whole, not only period of time, but it can change permanently how do you see an art object. Same in Mexico. I don't see the difference.
Yeah,
I organized an exhibition in Mexico City about surrealism it was at the January 2024 when surrealism was created formally by André Breton and this group of people who were part of his coterie of artists and writers, precisely writers. And this exhibition was an exhibition about surrealism in Latin America. It was not about the relationship between Mexico and surrealism, which we know very well. It's been on and on and on and on. This was an exhibition about a group that was created in Argentina, a group that was created in Venezuela, a group that was created in Chile and in the Caribbean, and the network that surrealism triggered and propelled in different moments. It was not late surrealism, because I don't think it was late surrealism. It was a different response to different moments. But it was a very, very interesting, I think it was an interesting show, and it was a museum show, and it occurred in a gallery. I curated it with Veronica Rossi, who's a friend of mine, she became a good friend of mine, and I met her at Malva. She was a curator at Malva, and I put together that Terapia show with her, which was precisely about that, origin of the relationship between psychoanalysis and surrealism, which is obvious, no? And I invited her to do this show, a little show, but it was a very historical show, very well put together, because we know that subject matter. And it was a beautiful show, but of course, the gallery didn't sell anything.
Were they, that was going to be my next question, like when you curate a gallery show that is sort of a museum show in that regard, does everything still need to be for sale, like in a normal gallery way, even though it's also didactic or pedagogical in its way?
No, museums hide this agenda, but they do it in the U.S., especially in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Because the art system is sustaining public museums, and we don't talk about that, but the art system sustains museums. Yeah. And of course, when they place a very important historical painting by, Pollock, for example, that they want to sell, and it's a historical work, and it's probably in an exhibition about Pollock, and it's for sale, but it's in the museum. So these things happen, and it's not, I don't think, because galleries are sustaining museums. They're paying for the catalogs, they're paying for the transportation, which is very expensive after the pandemic. I don't see it as the evil, making of the market. I think they invest a lot of money in museums to sustain museums. And also, some galleries like David Zwirner hired Helen Molesworth, and she's putting together one of the best podcasts, now that we're in a podcast, that it's on the air right now, which is the dialogues of David Zwirner. in which you can listen to serious discussions about how do you present the work of an African American artist in a big museum nowadays.
Yeah.
How do you? I mean, it's and David Zwirner is supporting that kind of public discussion.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, David Zwirner also has a really nice sort of series of books, like writings on art that have gone out of print, that they've reissued.
Yeah, he has a publishing house that he put together with people from the field. It's not that he hired people who know how to publish books.
Yeah. Not him personally. I meant David Zwirner Gallery. Yeah.
I mean, him in person. He hired many people who were, in the artwork, in the art book world, and they started this, publishing house.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why it's so professional and so well, put together. Same with the dialogues. I think Helen Molsford is doing a great job, with these dialogues. She's inviting people who are relevant to the topic, and she's bringing topics that they're not foreign to the gallery, because the gallery, of course, wants to bring more context to their, artists, but also is paying a service to all of us.
Yeah, that's an important point, the sort of relationship between galleries and museums being so close, and that they're, it's not that the gallery is producing the market value and the museum is producing the sort of knowledge production, that they're both doing both. Yeah.
No, I think that's an old-time prejudice, and I think there are worse things than that, and it's not a worse. It's a if they sustain museums when the public monies are, shrinking, that's very important, because they are acknowledging the importance of a museum in society. What is a museum for society? How the artist is going to, create this dialogical space with the society.
Yeah.
Only the museum.
Absolutely. Yeah. And do you have a sense of what sort of your role that you've described of being a public servant looks like in Tucson, in this particular city?
Well, I'm trying to understand Tucson, because I just arrived 9 months ago, and well, first of all, I don't drive. I have to start driving in order to be much more into the city. I walk from my house to the museum, but I'm trying to understand, the idiosyncrasies and the temperament and the contextual, nuances of this Southwest, which is very particular, as I said, and it's a slow cooking process, but I think I'm starting to understand.
Yeah. It has, a layered history like anywhere else, but the layers are kind of different than in other places.
Well, first of all, I come from New York, where it has a different timing for things and urgencies and a different weight, because in New York people walk and they take public transportation. That's a different that brings a different kind of approach to the other.
Yeah.
To the otherness and to togetherness and to it's a different, and to the city itself. So I think that's very important, because in America, in North America, in the U.S., only a few places exist in which you can relate to the city walking.
Yeah.
Only New York, maybe Boston, Chicago. What else? I mean, just a few cities.
Yeah.
This is a country made for the car.
Absolutely, yeah. And this region in particular, yeah, I always find it very funny that, the way we speak is we say, oh, it's 5 minutes away or it's 10 minutes away, but the assumption is it's 10 minutes away by car. It's not 10 minutes by any other mode of transportation. We assume the car all the time.
But it's also the desert. The desert is it's a particular, also mood and way of thinking and seeing things.
Yeah, and Arizona too. I mean, Arizona has a different desert history than California or New Mexico or Texas. It's, it just has a different...
What is the difference between Arizona and California, for example?
Well, California, the desert is a much smaller portion of the state, and I would say that Arizona is very influenced by, California builders. Like the way that we build houses in the U.S. now originated in California. So of course, Arizona was like the first place that Californians started coming to build. So we got our urban form from Southern California, but Arizona has always been this place where people come, wealthy people buy a second house and come for half the year, or people retire. I think that Arizona has really that reputation in a way that other deserts don't as much. That's not the identity of New Mexico in the same way, for instance. Yeah, so that's one,
Texas
one
also. Texas has a desert.
Yeah.
But it's very different. Texas is a different state.
Mm-hmm. Texas is its own world. It's so different.
Yeah, Texas is very particular. I realize that.
Yeah.
But you're not from here.
I grew up in Colorado, so it has similarities but also differences. Yeah.
With Arizona?
Yeah. I mean, it's also sort of part of the, Mexican cession, so it has the Spanish Empire history present, and it was the border at one point, but it no longer, and it has the same, white, like Anglo Protestant missionary history that we have. They're just sort of similar forces at similar times, but they look different now.
Gabriela Camara. Do you know Gabriela Camara?
I have her book right there. I don't know her personally.
Well, Gabriela Camara was the subject of a documentary that it's released in Netflix. And it's about the documentary is not about her only, it's about the two restaurants that she has. Well, she has more than two, but they use the case of two restaurants, one in Mexico City, which is Contramar, and the other one, I don't remember the name, in San Francisco. And when she was interviewed in that documentary, she said something that drove my attention. She said, I had to learn how to cook, how to create a restaurant for a country that loves Mexico and hates Mexico.
That's an interesting observation.
And I found it I said, why is she saying this? And then she elaborated and she said, they really love, the food and the culture, and they love to come to Mexico, but at the same time they reject the language and the culture. Mm-hmm. Therefore, so it's like a it's a two-way kind of relationship.
Yeah. And
I thought about it recently, and I said it's true. That's part of that imperial history and the cession of the, mm-hmm. and it's part also of the Spanish as a language, that it's been penalized right now, punished, and canceled. But it was not only, recently. I think it's an old story, the language.
Absolutely, yeah. And at one point in my doctorate, I read a bunch of the transcripts of congressional hearings in the time of the Mexican-American War, and they say exactly that. They say well, we want to take a bunch of land from Mexico, but we only really want the land where there aren't very many Mexicans. We don't want to deal with Catholics in our country, basically. The indigeneity, the Catholicism, the language, it was something that the United States did not want.
But at the same time, people want to go to Mexico, and they want to eat Mexican food all the time. And there are aspects of the country that are very much embedded here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. No, and there's a sort of a Mexico imaginary that's very different than Mexico, but that people go to Mexico to live out. So, mm-hmm. yeah, it's
for me, it's fascinating. The part that I place myself like a 19th century, traveler, saying, mm-hmm. Oh, this is amazing.
Right. Yeah. And the border is interesting, and Tucson is interesting because you have sort of both the imaginary of Mexico and the reality of Mexico present in one place. So, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we can start to close up, but one thing I wanted to ask you before we end was, of course, you've mainly spent your career in big cities and sort of metropolitan cities, and led a very sort of cultured existence. What are the ways that we sort of maintain that living in a smaller city? How do you sort of live a vibrant cultural life in a city like Tucson?
Tucson offers a lot of that cultural life, and people don't know. We have a great music scene here. We have a great, offer of artistic films or autorial films. And we have also literature. We have an important, hub of poetry and literature. So I think that's pretty amazing for a city like Tucson, like a borderland city. We have much more than many other cities,
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah.
Probably that's the most vibrant scenes, the ones that I just mentioned. But I think they're very interesting people living here. They live in a different kind of... People come here to forget about themselves, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, just sort of isolate the life of the mind in nature instead of in a,
I don't know if they live in nature. I have some people who don't live in nature and they live here. I have a friend who's a very important artist, and she landed here because her husband works for an NGO, an important NGO here. And she, she lives in her own world, and it's really interesting,
Yeah, that's actually true. It's sort of like actually more than the life of the mind, out isolated in nature. It's like life of the mind in the desert. In the suburbs is what I meant to say, because it's sort of a very suburban type of city. So, yeah.
It is and it's not, because as I said, we have hubs of music, literature, and cinema.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, you decide if you want to be at home or you want to also, connect with this, cultural production that it's available in the city.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
I don't know what your experience is, but,
I think there's always a lot going on here, and very accessible, very sort of, close at hand.
It's very accessible because it's not expensive.
It's not expensive. It's not like the overwhelm of there are 10 different things I could go do, and so what am I going to do? I'll just stay at home. Yeah.
Well, in the big cities, you don't know what to do, and you also need a lot of money to enjoy, what the city offers you.
Definitely.
If you want to go to a concert by Rosalia, then you have to pay like $1,000.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
It's
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's a big difference between living here and living in an accelerated city.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think acceleration is not doing any service to us.
Right. Yeah, we're all experiencing acceleration.
That's part of the problem. That's part of today's problem. And I mean, this is that zeitgeist. You have to be fast, and you have to be like here all the time, and that's not doing any service to us. You can see that in the books that we produce today.
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes you read books that feel like they were written very fast.
I mean, do you imagine like the history of the annals, the French historians, who wrote about the Mediterranean with the acceleration that we have to, or Foucault, or I don't know, or Hannah Arendt. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
To read today and to concentrate and to focus and to be serious about something.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are jumping from one subject to another. I think the desert can focus.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, sort of conserving slowness is important, and sort of the smaller and more isolated city enables you to do that more. Yeah.
It's like the movement of slow cooking. Do we need with fast food? We don't need fast food. We need slow cooking. We love artisanal food.
Yeah, that's true. Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to talking with you more in the future.
Thank you.
That was the Border Chronicle podcast, featuring an interview with Gabriela Rangel of Tucson's Museum of Contemporary Art. If you liked what you heard, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform, because it helps others find our work. Or you can subscribe at theborderchronicle.com. It's free to subscribe, but we also always welcome paid members, because they are the ones who really sustain our work. See you next time.
XDA.
because you've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero. You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.